everyone, and welcome to the PetroNerds podcast. We have a very special treat for you today. Obviously, this is not my dining room, normal studio. I have an incredible guest, which we're gonna do some role reversal here. But to start off, this is the PetroNerds podcast. It is episode 45, and my guest, or we'll get into this in a second. My sort of guest is Gabby Richmond with the Denver Petroleum Club. She's absolutely awesome, and I'm super pumped to have her here today. Which by here I mean the place that she brought me to. So, we're in this podcast studio, which is cool. So hopefully the sound is halfway decent. But we're going to talk about the global oil market today and the U.S. market. But we're going to do a bit of a fliparoo, and Gabby is actually going to sort of interview me. And I told people when I was in Austin last week that I was going to do this and I wasn't actually going to prepare. And they said, do that and then tell people you didn't prepare just to see how it goes. So this is going to be a fun sort of interview thing to talk about the market. And just to put this in context, I mean, this is it's Tuesday, April 26, 2022. There's a lot going on in the world. And Gabby and I had lunch. She knows the market really, really well. I've known her for a while. She's always at the events of the Denver Petroleum Club, but she's extremely knowledgeable on the market. So this will be really fun. And Brent closed at 106.08. WTI closed at 102.54, and Nat Gas closed at 6.85. And TTF, Dutch TTF, so we saw a spike in European natural gas prices. However, they're at $32, $32.24 from $1 per MMBTU perspective, and I'm sure we're going to be getting into all the reasons why we saw the spike in nat gas today. So without further ado, Gabby, how are you? And welcome to the PetroNerds podcast.
Thank you. I liked how you called it a fliparoo, because the Australian in me was like, oh yes, let's lean into that.
Oh, nice. No,
that could be the new catchphrase, yes. The Fliparoo podcast.
That's great.
And we are here at X Denver, and Trisha and I were just laughing earlier, because as Trisha walked up to the building, there is a rail line that goes right behind, and sure as shit, can I swear? Like, what's
I try not to, because
okay.
Justin Kringstad tells me that people in North Dakota don't listen if I say shit, so I try to limit
the
it.
Australian and me were really
yes.
But there was coal coming right past us, and then I said, other times I've seen natural gas and I've seen crude, and all the millennials who live here go, oh my gosh, did you know that we used that much? It's like, this is nothing.
So we'll be putting up a couple selfies of the coal cars, because I love it. At least there's a redeeming quality about downtown Denver, and it is the train tracks with the coal going through. And given all the stuff that happened today, actually, and it's been happening for the past since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and but particularly today. So from February 24th to today, I think we will find out that we've seen a considerable uptick in coal use. And we saw that actually last year. EIA came out with some figures. So I think coal use is actually going to surge, given the fact that nat gas prices are going up and the fact that Russia is turning off the taps, or potentially turning off the taps, to Poland and Bulgaria as of tomorrow. But with this, because Gabby and I, we spoke at length over lunch, and so we're sort of going to do this in an interview style where I'm going to be the guest and I'm going to be interviewed, and we will have this discussion format. So I truthfully don't know exactly what Gabby has prepared. But we're going to walk through the global oil market, and I'm assuming bring it back to the U.S. If this goes long, we'll take a pause and we'll break this up into 2 episodes. But without further ado, how about it, Gabby? Yeah.
Well, so this all came about because I said to Trisha at lunch, I love when you go what you call tangents, but I'm like, yes, keep going, go on the tangent, and I just love it. And so we kind of had this conversation. I said, I think your other listeners would love to have you just kind of run wild for one podcast episode and have someone ask you about your thoughts of the market. So for you, when you did a little bit of a teaser about this on your LinkedIn post, you said you're excited to talk about China. And the Australian in me, I think is a bit more concerned with China, as we mentioned at lunch, than maybe, some other folks that I've talked to here in Australia. It's all we talk about is the impact of China and what's China doing. So it's a lot more front of mind and center. And kind of diving in, I wanted to get your thoughts on China from a number of perspectives. But recently, as in last month, they came out with the 14th 5-year plan, the modern energy plan, as I'm sure you've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to open this, and it was really funny because it opened up in Chinese. It's like, I like to think I'm good, but I'm not that good. So I went through the Google Translate version. But they talk about these buzzwords, and it's clean, low carbon, safe, and efficient, right? And I just thought to myself, that doesn't really strike me as the China that I know. What gives? And in what 5-year plan do you think that this ties up in tandem with your use of coal? And what kind of story are you trying to tell? So I guess my question to you is, what are your thoughts? High level, do you buy it? And do you think China really is serious about clean, low carbon, safe, and efficient?
It's a great question. So I think China's current plans right now, I mean, the 14th five-year plan, to your point, is they basically do a big one, and then they do all these breakouts over time. And so I haven't actually looked at the Google Translate version of that, because I like to look at different scholars who do the full translation, so that they're translating the characters, and you're actually getting the correct meanings. But the real 14th five-year plan, which came out last year, I have read in depth, and there's a lot on energy in particular. Actually, Russia's actually mentioned directly within that 14th five-year plan. And the stuff on energy, folks probably don't realize that it's very, very intertwined with everything going on within China now. So the food and energy security is one of their 6 pillars that they've been talking a lot about. And this was something when people talk about Russia and they talk about Putin and they say, well, this is a new thing, and that the joint statement that they put out together on February 4th, that was new. But if you look back into the People's Daily and translations of the People's Daily, Putin was doing interviews with the People's Daily and with various Xinhua News and with various Chinese agencies all throughout 2021. So this was teed up well. So, I mean, this has been going on. And if you look at their trade volumes with each other, those have accelerated considerably as well. So this was sort of in the works. But with that being said, is that this food and energy security, I think, is really important to tie together, of thinking about how China is thinking about energy security, how they're thinking about food security, how they're thinking about their economy. And they have this dual circulation strategy right now, which is about basically it's emphasizing their domestic economy and emphasizing, building up jobs and then doing exports and sort of making the international folks come to them for their high-end tech and everything. And energy would be really critical with that if you're trying to become, a more high-end tech sector. So instead of slapping the Apple sticker on an iPhone and sending it out, you would be the ones that are making it, and not just making it, but the only ones able to make it, because you have all the critical components to make it. So within their 14th five-year plan, it's really serious if you actually read it, because it does get into the energy piece of, it's not like how much natural gas and coal and everything we're using. It's just that it's all of it's mentioned. So it is truly, I explain to people and I explain to clients, it's an all of the above approach. I mean, China is doing all of the above. And there's some podcasts I've listened to and some various things that folks within China talk about, but folks that cover renewables are covering the China stuff pretty intensely, because China has a very much a dual strategy where they're doing coal, and I can't use both my hands because I'm holding this mic, so but they're using coal and renewables in tandem. So when people say that China is building out, you always hear lots of folks in the oil and gas industry and others talk about China is building out a coal-fired power plant every week, so everything we're doing for emissions is all for naught. It's quite truthful that China is building out a coal-fired power plant nearly every week. I mean, the amount is huge because this country is massive. And so they are building out really, really strongly this year. They put several $billions into it just at the beginning of this year alone, into building out coal-fired power generation in lockstep, in tandem with renewables.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that their coal-fired power generation could power the entire of the U.S. It is their coal, which is about 55%.
So they have so much redundancy. So it's basically their grid is based 65 to 70% coal, which you can't probably believe that exactly. But the redundancy is essentially that we're building out coal-fired power generation and renewables together, so that when we're using the renewables, we're not using the coal and we're saving that. And when we're using the coal, and when the renewables aren't working, we have this redundant capacity. It's the opposite of what everyone in the rest of the world has done, where we're trying to just use renewables. And they actually admit that the transmission costs are extremely expensive for renewables. And I think they're sort of eating the cost. So it means that if it's that expensive, one, you're doing it to build up your renewable industry within your country, because you do definitely want to export it and you want to be the leader in those exports. And they've made very clear that they also want the renewable sector to equate by 2025 to be 1.7 trillion in economic output, which is massive, and nearly the size of their property sector, conveniently. So it's just a huge thing. So one, if you're building out your renewable sector and you're building literally a coal-fired power plant and you're building wind and solar next to it, the transmission costs are really high for these renewables. So it means that you're thinking about energy security very seriously, because if you're using wind and solar when it's working, then you're saving on coal. And they've had this big plan just lately. I'm really, really emphasizing the coal production. So the generating coal output, because Australia, as you know, you guys got hammered pretty hard by, asking questions about COVID origins, and then they sort of said, no more Australian wine, and
done with you, yeah.
No more Australian wine and no more coal imports, and that was just immediate. So regardless of WTO, regardless of everything, very much not playing by the rules, they just sort of enacted these things, and so only about 12%, it was like basically the only imports that they were getting for coal were from Australia, and only about 12% of their usage. But that 12% really added up significantly last year when we had the starting of the sort of energy crisis at the beginnings of last year with winter, and they turned off some coal production there because mines weren't safe. They turned off the taps for getting it from Australia, and then you end up with a situation where this is why energy security, this coal piece is so important. So they're ramping up coal production. They want to be completely self-sufficient in coal production. A lot of that coal is coming from the province of Xinjiang, which is where we produce all the solar and all the wind, where we also have forced labor and human rights abuses and 1 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims within some form of internment camps. But that's where a lot of the coal is, and China has lots of coal, and that means energy security.
Well, and so then on your last podcast episode, when you were talking about LNG, and you made a comment that I thought was really interesting that I wanted to dig into a bit more, about how you thought that it wasn't realistic to say that Chinese imports of natural gas is going to continue to increase at the rate that it's increasing right now because of your exact comment about energy security, and that they would want something they can produce more at home, that they don't have to import from other sources. And your podcast guest respectfully disagreed. And I wanted to ask if you had changed your mind on that, or if you still think coal is the way forward. And
I don't think it's realistic to look at anything China does. So if you're looking at what China's doing abroad, or anything they're doing with the foreign business community, and it's not a developing country and it's not within their sphere of influence, then no, that's not long-term sustainable. And China does a lot of things that don't make sense to a lot of entities. What's the question mark here, and I think what Renee was talking about, she's the head of strategy for Petroleum. It's also a public company. So, yeah. I fully respect, her comments and everything, but I did respectfully disagree because I think China, just because they're entering into long-term contracts with U.S. natural gas LNG exporters, which, by the way, I don't think U.S. natural gas LNG exporters should be doing that. I think I think it's not the right path for American companies, and I think the volatility and the problems that we're going to have with China down the road are going to make this really cumbersome. But the fact that China's entering into these long-term contracts is just the fact that that's probably they thought was best suited, and it's a very top-down. It's top-down country, so it doesn't mean that Xi Jinping was like, "Hey, go sign up that long-term contract." Yeah. They were just that's for. One is probably making sure, first and foremost, that they were securing the energy they need at the very moment. So you have to look at what they're consuming at the very moment, and that's because they had a shortfall of energy because they had too much hydropower and because they didn't have enough coal. So we have seen LNG imports fall off. In 2021, they dominated that space. They drove up nat gas prices, but that was because they didn't have their energy house in order. But if anyone thinks that China is going to allow themselves to be exposed to U.S. LNG, not a first chance in hell. That would be the opposite of energy security. The fact that China bowed out, Chinese national offshore oil company CNOOC, said that they're selling off their North Sea crude. Why would they sell off their North Sea crude? It's because they literally said would rather be in Guyana, would rather be in Africa, and it's like, well, of course you would, because you already have resources in Africa and in Brazil, and those are countries that you can control that don't have rule of law. That makes sense. So it's really a sign of that. A serious decoupling with the West. And so the idea that LNG will just be this sort of separate thing, no, they'll do it from an energy security perspective in the near term, but they don't, I mean, they'll burn those contracts. I mean, they overpay for everything, or have historically, especially when it comes to energy, especially when it comes to security, and all these things that people say, well, they just overpaid for all this stuff in Africa. And it's like, well, it's sort of panning out when you have a port in Djibouti, and I mean, you have these, like, you actually, you have a military port and everything. So I have a lot of disagreements with the China and Africa podcast that I listen to a lot. I love it. Have a lot of respect for the work, but I fundamentally disagree with a lot of their premise on China.
Well, and when you bring up the energy security, which is a big part of that plan, the other part of that plan, they say peak emissions by 2030. Then they also say net zero by 2060. And I look at that and I have a hard time buying it, with realistically agreeing with you that I don't think they're going to move away from coal in a meaningful way, in terms of especially even having a backup reliable source of efficient energy to all of their renewable build out. And then don't even get me started on the actual usage of renewables. But I guess my question to you is, have you thought about that any further on how they're going to achieve net zero by 2060?
It truthfully does not matter, because and I say this with all sincerity, but you won't be, like, China came out with their GDP figure. It was 4.8%, and people had expected 4.2%, and yet their unemployment figure had come up, so the unemployment had risen, but GDP had also risen, and there was a lot of, I mean, everyone knows that China cooks the books in this data, so that's going to be no different than your net zero stuff. And I think people really don't fundamentally appreciate why China participates so heavily in global institutions, why they participate so heavily in the UN, why they care so much about leading the third world, and why they really promote climate change. And it's, if you are producing all the solar and all the wind, and you have the International Energy Agency saying the whole energy transition rests on solar and wind, and it's all coming from China, then of course they're going to say, oh, by the way, we're going to curb our emissions. They're not going to, and they certainly can't. They're not going to hit their peak by 2030 at the rate at which they're building out coal-fired power generation. And that is, as I was talking about, it's redundant. It's redundant capacity. It's over capacity build for coal-fired power generation, but it's there and it will be used. And it's sort of like, now it's energy security. I mean, people in Europe are going to be burning lots of coal because they're going to need to, because that's how they're going to power their lives. And China is definitely going to do that. And as China as you know, being in Australia, and I'm sure lots of folks talk about this, but, what are their true ambitions and where they're going to go? They're certainly not going to do it on, a hope and a prayer's chance on solar and wind that it's working that day. No, you can't have you can't have a growing economy. You can't have a military based off that. Like, the solar and wind and renewables are the priority for them is to export it. And I think really building it out now, it's a win-win. It's a double benefit. But even in China, that solar is not effective when the sky is cloudy, but it's also because they have a lot of pollution. So their solar panels aren't as effective or efficient because of the pollution. And the wind side is like, it works well when the weather's cooperating. So when they had a hot summer, the wind wasn't blowing in the heat. If you ever driven through Wyoming when it's really hot, those wind turbines are not.
I try not to, if I'm being honest.
I like Wyoming. I mean, in the summertime, that's usually. But
unpopular opinion, the Australian here.
Yeah, well, so if you're driving by, you don't see those wind turbines moving, and it's those times where they're not moving, but it's like, okay, well, it's really hot in the summer, so you're going to have less hydropower, and it's the combination of all that. So that's really partly why. I mean, 17% of the grid, more than anybody in the entire world, is their hydropower, and that makes a huge. I mean, that's really, really important when you think of it as they're adding renewables. They absolutely need that coal-fired backup. So no, they're not going to peak emissions by 2030. They will say they will, and they just can't. I mean, even right now, Xi Jinping came out today and said, because the market's selling off Chinese stocks, and you've got folks leaving China left, right, and center, and so they said, hey, we're going to start spending on infrastructure again. And infrastructure is like the debt on these property developers and these empty homes and everything. It's insane, but yet that's what they're going to have to do to keep people employed. And so if you're doing that, you sure as hell cannot reduce emissions.
Yeah, and these coal-fired power plants have, 20 years on them from a life perspective?
Oh, yeah.
They're not going to retire them early.
No, and they're not even going to, I don't even think you're going to retire them not early. I mean, you have to think about this from a very strategic, sort of like, China is not Europe. China does not care about the I mean, basic human rights or anything, but they certainly do not care about emissions the way Europe does, or the way lots of people think that they do not. They're saying it's to tick a box. It is not because they believe in reducing emissions. That's not how the Communist Party works. I mean, Communist Party is at the top, and so if emissions are going to threaten the Communist Party, they're just going to say, hey, we solved it, and we're not going to do it. And I mean, China went to Europe for their meeting a couple weeks ago, and Europe and China had a dialogue, and it was, I'm blanking on the guy's name because I can't pronounce it correctly, so I'm not going to botch it. But anyways, the European delegation is meeting with the Chinese, and Europe is just completely focused on Ukraine. They want China to participate in helping to tamper down the Ukraine stuff, helping to have peace dialogues and everything. And all China said was, hey, can we talk about climate change? Can we talk about climate change? Which means, can we talk about our solar and wind exports to you? And they actually were putting out, within China, within 15 minutes of the meeting, they had already put out the conclusion of the meeting and to China, to the Chinese people. So it's ridiculous. And if you Google Global Times, and do it daily, like Google Global Times and see it's in English, and it's like opposite world of that's Chinese media, that's what they're saying, and it's like opposite of everything that's actually happening in reality.
Okay, now I'm going to have to go do that.
Yes.
But it's probably going to make me angry, so I have to wait till I have a glass of wine.
Yeah, well, it's crazyville. So it's like one of those things, when you just do a lot of in-depth studying on China, you really you realize that the emissions thing is it's just not something to be taken seriously.
Not realistic. Well, I can't say I'm surprised, but I did want to get your thoughts on that. And, kind of the last thing on China before I'll move away from it somewhat, the zero COVID policy. And everyone's talking about it right now. And I think everyone is concerned about supply chains. Everyone's stressing out. You have, I think I heard a couple of days ago, 350 plus cargo tankers that are waiting outside Shanghai. We've all heard, maybe we haven't, I have watched the video of people in Shanghai screaming from their balconies and from their apartments. And it puts a very human element on what's happening that I think it's important to layer over when we have these economic conversations. But what's your view going forward on how long that's going to impact markets for, what that's going to do short term, what that's going to do through the end of the year?
So it's huge. And it's because there's a lot of elements to this zero COVID strategy, which I think I've talked about a little bit, but not in depth. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it. So Shanghai is a city of 25 million people. So it's a huge city. And this shutdown started at the end of March, beginning April. And people were told 4 days, you have 4 days to lock down. So in Shanghai, just as like in big cities, people buy groceries the day of. It's very fresh food and lots of vegetables, and you keep hearing about no vegetables. And it's interesting because I've went through every podcast on this topic where people are talking, and we have heard more probably out of this because there's so many foreigners that live in Shanghai. And so that's why this has gotten so much attention, is because people are very outraged. So even Bloomberg and CNBC are doing a horrible job of covering this in depth. BBC is actually, talked about these stories, and I was pretty impressed that they were, at the beginning talking about them. But the first things were like literally parents being like 2-year-olds being removed from their parents, and the mom being like, it was like a 2-year-old or toddler that had got COVID, and so they were separating them and they were taking the toddler to a quarantine facility. And when you start learning about these quarantine facilities, they're sheds, they're like shacks, there are no doctors there, they're not even like proper toilet facilities or bathing or anything. And so when you're sending
any kind of care, it's a joke.
There's no care. So they're taking people out and they're putting them in these quarantine facilities, and this same with elderly is like these people are dying in there.
People are knocking down their parents' and grandparents' doors, I heard.
Yep.
To try and check that they're alive.
Yep. It's you have this, the human element is super, super serious, and it really does get to the fact that like, what is the zero COVID strategy? And when you say they say, well, it's to save the people. It's like, I'm sorry, this is not a human strategy, because what's happening is they're literally welding people in their homes. So they're completely boarded up, or like welded them in their homes. And the lack of food. I mean, when they did this shutdown, and think about, people commend China for their ability to just enact a policy. Well, it's like they enacted this policy. Everybody shut in their homes, and they complied with it because it was supposed to be 4 days, and then they were going to do, and then it was another 4 days, and then it's been indefinite.
It's like
so
21 days now.
Yeah, they're pushing. I guess they've been pushing a month, and then now they're saying it's going to go till May 8th at least, perhaps. So food orders have been starting to come in, but the elderly don't have phones and apps, so a lot of them are not internet savvy, so they haven't been able to do this. And so they have reported, we're hearing from different podcasts, various sources that, older people are dying because they're not getting food or just care. We heard before even these shutdowns that a pregnant woman, a pregnant woman had lost her baby because she was in front of a hospital and she wanted to go to a hospital for care and couldn't get into the hospital because she did not have a negative COVID test. And same, it was for children who didn't have a negative COVID test. I think they were having asthma attack or something. There's multiple stories like this. And these stories, by the way, if you really dig into, Apple Podcasts and you're listening to this stuff, these stories get put on their Weibo chat system and then they're immediately deleted. So people post them up and they get immediately deleted and the government says this is against their rules. But the fact that it's already out there and then people screenshot this stuff and eventually gets out. And the reason we're hearing so much more about this is because, as I was saying, Shanghai is this global city and so you have a lot of foreigners. And this is just so serious they've said, hey, they've increased their death count, and they keep saying it's the elderly, they weren't vaccinated, but they could have died from COVID, they could not have died from COVID, they could have died from starvation. They don't have clean drinking, a lot of them don't have proper drinking water and just not proper access to food. And so these delivery systems, a lot of folks have been, communities have been getting together and doing these massive bulk orders if they can even get the drivers to come into the city because they've locked them. And then most recently, they've had all these people have been talking about the barricades they're seeing in front of their apartments so even if they wanted to go for a little walk outside, they're not allowed to, but they have complete barricades up. And it's just it's really, really sad from the human perspective. I think it's very illustrating to how China functions as how top-down stuff actually works. And so think about that just in terms of policies for renewables and stuff. It's not going to be clean.
Conversation before, this is really proving your point of they're going to do whatever the heck they want to do.
Right, and it's super messy. It's very painful. And the zero COVID policy, I think, up until this point, one, they don't have mRNA vaccines, so they don't have the vaccines that we've used largely in the West. Interesting that I think they could now because they've signed some deals with BioNTech, but they haven't rolled them out. But they also had, China and lots of Asia, and I'm by no means pretending to be an epidemiologist, but all the stuff I've listened to on South China Morning Post and Inside China and some great stuff is they do have a lot of epidemiologists, and if you think about it, they were also exposed to various SARS and stuff that we weren't. So in the beginning of this virus, when people ask, how come you don't have a lot of elderly vaccinated, both in Hong Kong and in China, and it was because they weren't getting sick before, and they just sort of resisted the vaccine, not because of any, I don't want the vaccine, but because they didn't think they needed it because they weren't getting sick and dying. And the problem is the Omicron or this latest wave or whatever it is, it's so contagious. I got it after being vaccinated. I got it, in January.
Same. I think everyone got it.
Everyone got it. Super, super quick, rapid spreading. And so the ability to contain this, and that's where this gets really wonky and silly, is that you're testing every day, and that's why the stock market went crazy and why everybody's freaking out is because they're doing this mass testing in Beijing and they're coming up with these numbers. And then you ask yourself, these are they'll show up with 20,000 cases a day. Only 800 of those 20,000 will be symptomatic. So you really have to start saying, what is going on? No, people aren't actually sick. And so you're saving the people, you're doing this for the elderly, but the elderly are dying anyway because you're not feeding them, you're not taking care of them. And you're separating parents and children. It's quite scary. there is no rule of law. There's no institutions. You're getting to really scary territory. And the market, and I know we have a war going on in Ukraine, but it's really given China a pass on these, human rights abuses to the nth degree, let alone the stuff going on junk, but to, these everyday citizens. And people are they're navigating and they're doing better. And it's if Shanghai, they start doing these lockdowns, the implications, separate from the human element to your point of the ports. So Shanghai is a big, obviously a big port, and you can see, I think Bloomberg had some good maps they put out. You can see the congestion.
Yep.
And we saw that in Hong Kong. So you do have port congestion, and then the days actually to ship is really what's gone up. And they went from, 20 to 40 days like in 2019 to we're looking at 100 plus days from China to the US, and over that to go, and like 120 days to go from China to Europe. So I think what's really interesting is that we could very well end up with, and the fact that, I don't know if you saw earnings today, Google, several companies did not do, stellar, and the market took a dive because we have way too much, weighted on tech. But I know from that article that people were saying they have tried to cancel their orders. Well, of course you can't cancel your order mid-shipment. I mean, it takes 100 days. But we could end up with actually a lot of inventory. And we do have congestion because we don't have enough people to unload the ports and not enough truck drivers and everything. But it's just one single element to this of like the ability to turn on and shut down cities and ports is the ramifications are really, really huge. And I just think if you're looking at this straight as just a COVID thing, you're probably getting it wrong. There's a lot of things happening within China, but it's the implications for global supply chains are really, really serious, especially in the context of this war in Ukraine and the exacerbation of energy and the potential issues with grain, which is another thing China's emphasizing is this grain security, which they're buying a lot of grain from Russia.
That was a lot to digest.
That was a rant. You said you like the tangents in the rant, so that was the rant.
No, I love it, and exactly to your point. I think it's surprising to me, knowing how China prioritizes their economy, this zero COVID policy, and the impact that it's having on the global economy and must be having on their own economy. It's shocking to me that this is where we're at. I mean, as an Australian, get me started on, every time I talk to someone at an event, they're like, oh, Australia during COVID. Gosh, that would have been horrible. Thankfully, I wasn't there. But it's taking a very similar vein to me, and I'm just kind of surprised that that's where their priorities are, is zero COVID. But.
Yeah, and I've been honestly listening to people, foreigners within Shanghai, and hearing their stories, like being interviewed and stuff, and I'm sort of shocked at some people, the acceptance of it, because they'll say, hey, our area's nice, or I'm a teacher, and we actually have a really nice apartment, so we can't complain, and we have enough food to get us by, and all this stuff. So I think for a lot of folks who are well-equipped, it's fine, but there are so many that aren't. It's 25 million people. And another really sad piece is that, so China's system of, like, rural versus their Hoku system, which is like how they class people of like urban and rural. So
I don't know about this. So I'm like,
yeah,
yes,
don't even get me. So when China puts out on their Global Times, you'll see all the stuff on human rights and how it's all bad in the U.S. So they have a rural, like people categorized as rural, people categorized as urban. And China scholars, if they listen to this, will probably be, I'm not doing this proper justice, but it's called the Hoku system. And so when you're born, you're designated as rural or urban, and you get a lot less benefits in society if you're born as rural versus urban. And so when you see that unemployment data is only, that shot up and is pushing 6%, is only urban. It does not include the rural population, which is several hundred million people.
And you can't change once you're assigned,
I think some people have done it. I've heard it. There was a professor I saw at Columbia University that she said she actually is in America, obviously, and is a professor, and she was born in the rural. So I have no idea how that changed. I'm sure there's ways to buy your weight of or something, but it is actually for all reality, it's very difficult to change that. But you have all these migrant workers, which is something you might have heard about in these lockdowns as well, because your migrant workers are a lot of people who they just come into the cities and they do a lot of Uber driving and deliveries and everything. Well, they have nowhere to go. So they're just stuck in these cities, living out of their cars. They're not getting paid. And these are very low paying jobs. We're talking, a couple $1,000s a week of actually in their currency. So, I mean, this is not a ton of money. And it's like, so the migrant worker piece is just a whole other element of, people that aren't even talked about from a real economic perspective. China does not give us real color and clarity. And that 4.2% number is beyond cooked. I mean, I would be shocked if they're even north, if they're in positive territory. But I certainly think that unemployment figure is higher. We see that in youth unemployment data, which is probably, it's high teens. So there are a lot of people in China without jobs as the property sector is declining and all these things. And so I wouldn't say the COVID strategy is necessarily to mask it, but it certainly gives there's a clear reasoning when the economic data is going to be really bad. There's a very clear reason to say, well, we shut down that city, therefore this data is going to be really bad. And so I think there's not a lot of I've been disappointed in a lot of the the analysis and stuff I've heard of just like that no one's asking the sort of the deeper questions of why. I mean, this is a really, really serious thing for the second largest economy, different style of economy altogether, but is the second largest economy in the world. And so the ramifications are huge, but there's logic to why they would be doing something like this.
There's a lot to dig in. I feel like we could spend an entire podcast just on China, and maybe one day we will. But I do want to keep on that geopolitical front.
Yes.
And you've mentioned Russia and Ukraine a number of times, and obviously big news today with Russia only accepting rubles and discussing cutting off taps and to Poland and Bulgaria. And I want to get your thoughts on that, and again, what you think the ramifications will be. If you think they'll actually do it, if you think they're serious and they're not bluffing, and then we can dive into some other nuances after that.
Yeah, so I don't think they're bluffing. I think that this shows an escalation in how their seriousness, and I think it shows Russia's escalation in the seriousness of how they see this war and how seriously they want to be taken seriously. So they've said, hey, we want this crew, we want these our products done, paid for in rubles, and this is, you have to do this if you want to play ball. And they know that Europe really needs this gas. However, when it comes to Bulgaria and Poland does have a lot of they have ramped up LNG import facilities over the past several years. So they've been sort of working on this. So Poland has said that they're not okay with it, but I mean, they're okay with this. But it's Germany and Hungary who have been the holdouts in Europe, in the European Union, that have said, hey, no, we aren't willing to ban, Russian energy. And all of Europe, I think that there was a ban on coal, which is, in terms of a dollar amount, it's low, right? It's like $4 billion a year versus we're talking like $1 billion a day. Well, I mean, in terms of the prices we're seeing is really high. I believe that's the math. I could have that wrong, but massive amount of money from Europe for energy is going to Russia. If you looked at Russians' foreign currency reserves, those came down. Obviously, in the month of this last month, the most recent data for month, it came down, but I mean, it's a blip on the radar because their foreign currency reserves were all-time highs. So rubles would really help them, though, in the ability to. They basically wanted to take it into one bank, exchange it into rubles, and then they would have it in their system because they want to function off rubles. I think they're serious. We'll see if this the extent of it. I didn't see is this going to extend all the way? This will have ramifications because these pipelines move throughout these countries. But if you're
through Ukraine, if I'm correct, I think it was Mark Rossano. I was reading something he wrote, and he's like, the interesting part about all of this is Europe buys gas from Russia, and Russia takes it through Ukraine, and they just kind of do this.
So that's why if you're looking at the map, and I was struggling with it a little bit today, and I'm by no means I have not got to rework this back, but if you're looking at the map, you just see these pipelines that go through Ukraine and then onward and into Germany and elsewhere. So the extent, my question is, and I don't know this right now, is Poland, is it just Poland and Bulgaria? How much of it is passed through? How are they shutting all of it down? Are they shutting the volumes down? Because if you have some pass through, but it was Poland and Bulgaria were specified. So we'll see how far this goes and the clarifications behind it. And I truthfully don't have if I had known exactly, is it just Poland, is it just Bulgaria, here's the exact volumes. And I always struggle because everyone puts the numbers and they say the percentage of exposure that these countries have. And it's I want to see MCF a day, BCF a day, what is this? And they're not, we don't have those perfectly. So it's, yes, lots of Nordic countries are heavily exposed, and you have Germany that's really, really exposed because they import so much gas. So if they turned off the taps, it would be severe. Now, for Poland and Bulgaria themselves, I think Poland, one, it's getting warmer in Europe, so that's beneficial from a gas side. So they have some in storage, and they say they're okay right now. It doesn't mean that prices won't surge, and I think prices will, if the taps turn off, the prices are going to go up. We'll see an actual surge in pricing, so we'll see to the extent. But if it's just Poland and Bulgaria, it's not the same as if we're turning off Germany. And staring at the map with Ukraine, it's the fact that it's still flowing and it's going through is just quite interesting to me, because Ukraine is talking so much about obviously wanting that no one should be buying this stuff, and inevitably they're probably getting,
you're getting paid, exactly,
right.
Europe's funding Russian military is funding Ukraine military, and it's all.
But the ability for, I think, the ability to knock out pipelines in Ukraine, that's actually there, and I think it's extremely, extremely important. but it really comes to me, it's about the volume. So it's like saying, when people were tweeting and texting and everything and putting on like all the volumes of the Russian barrels that had left the market. They didn't leave the market. I mean, yeah, some are having the stickier and they're having trouble finding homes, but they're at a $30 discount to Brent.
And India's picking them up, China's picking them up,
right.
They're floating on the sea somewhere.
So they're moving and
mixed in.
Exactly. So it always comes about to like, and it takes time for the market to get that. Nat gas is different because this is being piped. This is a completely different molecule and very, very different. But it also puts an onus on, and I didn't hear. I think Jen Psaki had made some comments on it, but I didn't hear the response from like the ramping up of the U.S. basically said, hey, we're coming to the aid, but it's like you have to ramp up these exports. So, and we do have the ability in the U.S., and I'm probably doing a nice pivot onto the U.S. here because we're sort of been talking about the global stuff a lot. So, and I feel like Gabby is gonna. I was about ready to get into the U.S. stuff, so I feel like that's where Gabby wants to go with that.
Yes, this is perfect.
Awesome. So with that, that is the conclusion of part 1, and the next episode you will hear will be part 2. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll be back with part 2 next week.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. See you next week.